are going to talk about the position statement that is in your handout. And I could dance. Yeah, next, can you do next slide from the back again, please? There we go. So every time I do, every time I do one of these, let me just move away from this a little bit like this. Every time that I do one of these, I always, if you saw me last year, I always Google the night before to give you the most up-to-date information, ambulance crashes. And I was in Salt Lake City last week. So this is November 20th, if you look at the date on this. Ambulance in Provo hit while going through intersection, 6 people taken to the hospital. So I'm sure all of you can think, just from that headline, okay, what happened? They went through an intersection, they're hit, 6 people go to the hospital. How could that possibly have happened? They must have been going against a red light. Next slide. So 6 people taken to the hospital. Whoop, too many next slides. And it included 3 EMTs, the patient, the driver of the vehicle that struck them. It also included an EMT student, is the one that's not listed there. They were all taken to the hospital. So what does that do when your agency has an issue like this? Suddenly you went from taking 1 patient to the hospital with a whole bunch of EMS clinicians in the back to now having a bunch of your clinicians going to the hospital, requiring multiple EMS vehicles to take all these people to the hospital, disrupting your whole service, and you've got a vehicle that's out of service. It says here they were traveling westbound while on its way to the hospital. The Toyota pickup truck failed to yield to the ambulance, striking it, right? So when I read that, I think failed to yield, probably because the ambulance was using lights and siren, going through the intersection against traffic, and often we say, oh, they failed to yield. Chances are they didn't see the vehicle coming. Next slide. At the time of the crash, the ambulance had its lights and siren running. The ambulance was requesting the right-of-way through the intersection. And all of the vehicles at the intersection gave the right-of-way except the Tacoma that hit the ambulance. And I'll bet if you asked the driver of the Tacoma, they had a green light, they were going with traffic, they didn't hear the siren, even though it's, we think they can hear us. They didn't see the lights, and they broadside an ambulance. So, just an example that this stuff happens every day. And as you just heard, it happens a lot in Michigan as well as Pennsylvania and every other state. Next slide. So that sort of sets the tone for why we're still looking at this. Historically, and I don't want to repeat things for the people that were here the last 2 years, but there is a little history to how we built to this position statement we're going to talk about today. And, I take it back a little bit to October 2019, when Dr. Kramer, who's in the back of the room, when he was at NHTSA, had a study to look at the use of lights and siren by EMS vehicles. And, we had had a lot of things happen for 30 years prior to that. And I would say that that's when I first started to see a lot of talk and communities working. There, again, my first paper on lights and siren was in 1994. But despite all of that, and despite lots of presentations and that sort of thing, the needle never moved. Well, in 2019, with this paper, the needle started to move, and we started to see communities and places making changes. And then in 2022, there was a joint statement on lights and siren vehicle operations on EMS responses. And that's the one that's up there on the board now. It was a multi-organizational paper, and it was done specifically just looking at lights and siren. The paper we're going to talk about today basically takes the next step, because this paper in 2022 was saying, we need to reduce the use of lights and siren, it's dangerous, it's not adding to patient care, etc. But many jurisdictions, thank you very much, many jurisdictions continued to use a response time parameter as the only thing that you did when you put your EMS out to bid. And I know that we have a lot of people in this audience who are not necessarily EMS clinicians, but are involved with local government or state government. And jurisdictions had very little way to say, how can we measure the quality we're getting out of our EMS agency other than we're going to hold them to a standard of response time. And so this paper said that's probably not the best thing to do, but it didn't really tell people how to replace that. So, all right, next slide. There we go. Thank you. So the follow-up to that, which had about 13 organizations on it, is that we had 16 organizations come together just recently to do this 2024 paper that you have. And it's a relatively short thing. It's only 2 pages long. It's like, what's the big deal? But this is a big deal because this was 16 organizations that were EMS, quality, safety, local community government agency or association, and fire, all coming together. We talk about bipartisan things. This is like quadripartisan or quintuple partisan to get many organizations from all of these types of industry to come together to say, yeah, this is the way we ought to be going forward. Next slide. So that led to this joint position statement, which you don't have to read or take pictures of here because Colby was nice enough to put that into your handout. Next slide. And you saw in the title that it was, what are the measures beyond rapid response or lights and sirens? So this is sort of the next step. What do you do if you are a community? You could be an EMS agency trying to say, all right, all we have ever looked at is our response times, but let's start looking at other things. You could be a local government entity who says, we're going to change the way we put out our RFP for EMS in our community. We're not going to make it based on solely response times. We're going to make it based on some other quality indicators. So one of the highlights in the article is this little section that talks about, well, what are the other things that you can measure? And I think that's been the big issue for a lot of time, is that measuring the response time was a relatively easy thing for an agency to get, for a community to follow, for community leaders to get, because you could go right to your 911 center and say, what's their response times? The other things take a little more effort, but they are far more important. So you see here, is the EMS care that your system is giving, is it effective? Is it safe? The lights and siren thing talks a lot to safety because we are causing sometimes more injuries and damage than we're helping. So is it safe? Is it satisfying? What are your sort of customer satisfaction side of the EMS you're giving? Are the people that are transported and cared for by your EMS system feeling like they're getting good service? Are they happy with the care and compassion and communications they're getting from the EMS clinicians at the time of their emergencies? Is it equitable? And equitable is increasingly important. I'm going to show you a slide later when I talk at the end of the day about some of the things that some communities are doing, even in CPR care, to look at great disparities in how equitable it is in whether or not you get CPR. And you can be in certain cities, and if you're in one part of the city, your chance of getting bystander CPR is almost none, and if you're in another part, it's more than 50%. So, whoops. All right, Matt, I know what you're saying. This is because he turned his slides in late. Thank you, Matt. I'll be sure to heckle when you're up here. So the point is, there are many things that we can look at other than just our response times. And some of those other things can be measured relatively easy, customer satisfaction surveys, et cetera. Others take a little bit of work. And unfortunately, the thing that we would think should be the easiest, like how good is the patient care, is some of the most difficult stuff to measure. Because when we're looking at patient care, specifically and outcomes and that sort of thing, it takes a bit of effort to actually, look into those specific parameters. So this paper is all about, is really all about how you measure things beyond that. And I'm going to talk later again today, focusing on some of the things that take a deep dive into clinical aspects of the care that are given. And there are many other things like the patient satisfaction, et cetera. Colby, to keep us on, should, I guess I'm not behind anyway on my time, but I am a little bit ahead. So, anybody know any good jokes? Yes.
So, as a fire administrator, recently we've been doing our ISO rating, right? Well, ISO rates on response time. So here I sit here and listen about quality of care, patient care, and all that. But my citizens, their homeowners insurance is based on an ISO, which has response time. So we need some sort of connection between what you're thinking.
Yep. So I think, one of the things that we will, that concept of response time is difficult to get away from, especially if you're fire service based. So their homeowner's insurance is not based on whether the ambulance gets there when they are having a headache or that sort of thing, but it is, they care about when they get there to put out a house fire, right? That's the insurance issue that they care about. And so insuring for your homeowners and fire insurance does have some tie to response time, but we're talking EMS response times here. So, response times to the medical calls. Yep. I get that. These are all things we have to work through, but the fact of the matter is how fast the EMS unit gets to a medical emergency has nothing to do with the quality of the care that your EMS agency is giving. And yeah, well, we have lots of audiences to hit, right? But one of the things that you'll see as a theme in the day is that there are, we're not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're not saying that when you have a suspected cardiac arrest, or the 1% of EMS calls that can be identified as a potentially life-threatening emergency that needs to save the 2 to 3 minutes to get there. We are not saying take the lights and sirens off of the vehicles. We're saying that they should be limited to those really important calls that are time sensitive. And the flip side of that is that for the other 95+% of calls that you go on, we should be measuring something else, because how fast you got there is not the answer. And on top of that, the system that sets you up to get there that fast also sets you up to not provide service to some other things because you're trying to get to every call that quickly. And you will hear later in the day some innovative things that, that show you that some of these patients can wait. I have been saying one of the things I've been using for a long time is that EMS needs a waiting room. All of your citizens go into the emergency department, and if they're going in there with a little cut on their finger while they were, slicing cucumbers, or if they're going in there for a headache or something like that, the people that are in your community that arrive at your emergency department are fully expecting to be put out into the waiting room and have to wait for a bit before they are seen for their medical issue. It should be the same thing for EMS, because we can't run an effective system and get the most trained people to the right place at the right time if they are tied up trying to go emergently to every single call that comes into the 911 center. I don't know if we'll have slides today, which is not a problem for me. We can go without. Yeah, Mark Meyer, thank you. Good to see you here.
So, in addition to the two pages that you have in the material, you see all of the organizations getting together to say, okay, here's to recommend whatever, but here is really how you measure a system, because that still is the next step, and I know maybe that's something we talked about later on today. But to get all of those organizations to support, here's the kind of the definitive list, and then here's some optional jump for your particular area.
Right, exactly. And so his question was, these organizations are getting together. And the point is, there are many different options for whether it's your community leaders that want to measure the service, whether it's your agency that just internally wants to say, how good a job are we doing? Because not every community is under an RFP with response time standards and things that, and are being, heaven forbid, penalized, monetarily because they're not meeting response time standards when they might be giving incredible, good patient care. So, that was going to be the next slide I was going to talk about. Well, that was that's we're coming to the end slide. If that was it, you're going to see the whole thing. Then we'll put it back in order here, hopefully. So that's the point. Is that, or another point that you made that I think is important, which was on this next slide, is that it does get exceedingly difficult, and there are many things you can do. So, we're not saying that every single community in an RFP has to have an RFP that says, oh, there are like, 60 things that you have to be measuring. To some communities, they might say, patient satisfaction is really important to us, and we want to make sure that you're using a satisfaction scale that we approve. Maybe we'll even send them out and collect them, but we want to see how you're doing, and we want to get patient satisfaction results back. Another community might say, we're really invested in the clinical outcomes, so we want to see that you are giving good cardiac arrest care, and your survival in cardiac arrest care is above the state average or the national average. And if you're doing that, we're not really that worried about how fast you're getting there, because you're saving lives and things are going well. Whoop, if you can back up one now, we're, there we go. So in addition to the 5 things that I just showed you about effectiveness and satisfaction and that sort of thing, this is another point that is in there. And this point is actually an addendum to the paper. And it's an addendum because it says on here 3 times, these are examples. It doesn't mean that every community has to have a gigantic RFP that's incredibly complicated. They could pick a couple things. We want you to participate in CARES and see cardiac arrest survival. We want you to participate in, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about NEMSQA, and we want to see that you're meeting those parameters. We want to see that you have patient satisfaction. Communities and agencies can pick what they feel are locally issues or things that they want to measure. This is just examples to show local government officials as well as EMS agency leaders that there are things you can be measuring and should be measuring on a regular basis to know what kind of quality your agency is giving.